Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this edition of the 700 Club. It looks like Donald Trump is putting together one of the best cabinets that, in memory, I can't remember when there have been so many outstanding people being named to the cabinet. And the one that's coming in now, this guy was running the biggest corporation in the world, at least for industrial corporation, ExxonMobil. Rex Tillerson, what a wonderful name. And isn't that a great name, Rex Tillerson?
Right, yeah. It's really, I think also, you know, in keeping with Trump's whole wanting to bring experts that are not just politicians into play. And I think people are appreciating that.
You've got a world statesman who's been, negotiating with governments all around the world. He's very knowledgeable, a very fine person, and but man, the left, the barrage of cat calls coming out of places like the Washington Post, they make you sick. Somebody ought to, set fire to the pages of that awful publication. Jeff Bezos bought that thing, and you'd think, well, what he's afraid of, that Trump's going after him for antitrust, so he's doing everything he can to weaken trust. Trump, I mean, behind the scenes is always something. But I heard yesterday, and maybe you're right, that there's some people that say that all these regulations that Obama's been adding on, that Trump might just, on the day one, just by the stroke of a pen, cancel all the executive orders, which he has a perfect right to do. Every one, he could cancel all of them and then put back selective ones that he thinks are important.
Which would be a wise move to
be selective. A wise move, and it would save trillions. Actually, the cost of regulation is, what is it? How many trillion? 3 trillion? 4 trillion? It's a huge amount of money. It is. It's all the national debt. But that's what regulations, and they just keep laying them on. Well, if we're going to, we got thrown out of office because of these, so let's double down and have twice as many. The Democrats don't get it. Okay. Well, Terry, what do you got?
Well, the nomination of Tillerson comes as some Democrats are raising questions about whether the Russians tried to influence the election in favor of Trump. Gary Lane has the story.
President-elect Trump's choice of Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State is controversial.
Usually you look in the Secretary of State for someone who has some level of diplomatic experience.
While Tillerson lacks diplomatic and political experience, as CEO of the ExxonMobil oil company, he's developed many friendly relationships with world leaders. He's received the Russian Order of Friendship Award and has close ties to President Vladimir Putin. That's raised concerns on Capitol Hill. Some think he's a bit too close to the Russians. The Tillerson nomination comes at a time when both Democrats and Republicans are calling for an investigation of alleged Russian meddling in the recent U.S. presidential election.
The Russians are not our friends. I hope that those who are going to be in positions of responsibility in the new administration share my view.
On The Daily Show, President Obama said Russian attempts to influence American elections dates back to the Soviet Union days. He says an investigation and report may prevent such actions in the future.
What they did here, hacking some emails and releasing them, is not a particularly fancy brand of espionage or propaganda.
But Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, says Russia was not the source of the hacked DNC and Podesta emails released by his news organization during the presidential campaign. And some of those in the agency that oversees all U.S. intelligence, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, reportedly disagree with the CIA assessment. Reuters reports they said the assessment that Russia acted to boost Trump over Hillary Clinton lacks conclusive evidence. And just days before the Electoral College electors meet next Monday to cast their votes making the presidential election final, at least 10 of them say they want a national intelligence briefing to determine if Trump is fit to serve. Critics say it's just another attempt by Democrats and some members of the Hillary Clinton campaign to delegitimize the Trump victory. And vote recount efforts are now over. Judges stopped the efforts in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and Trump gained another 131 votes after the recount in Wisconsin. Meanwhile, Trump is making his final choices for his White House team. He's chosen Goldman Sachs President Gary Cohn as his chief economic advisor. Cohn will be the third Wall Street executive to join the Trump administration. With a little more than 1 month to go until Inauguration Day, Trump has only a few cabinet picks remaining. Some of those selections are controversial, so he's likely to face ongoing attacks about the course he plans to set for his administration and the country in the days ahead. Gary Lane, CBN News.
You know, we're living in it's like they talk about a Potemkin village. You wonder what in the world is going on in this world we live in. You know, first of all, they said to Mr. Trump, are you going to accept the results of the election? Well, he said, I'm not sure, because he hadn't thought it through. So all of a sudden, Michelle Obama jumps on him. Everybody jumps on him. Isn't that shocking that here is a man who's going to violate the canons of ethics of this great nation and refuse to accept the will of the people? Okay, so the election is over. Donald Trump won fair and square, and he wants to be named president. So what's happening? The people who were taking such horror at his stand are all saying, well, we won't accept the results of the election. We've got to have, can you imagine, we've got to have a briefing to the electors on whether he's fit to serve? That is absurd. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that. But they're doing everything they can to demean him, to discredit him. And the pile-on goes on from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the CNN, all these people. And in my opinion, I say it again, he has picked one of the most superb cabinets in my lifetime. These people are really qualified, and plus they're qualified as conservatives, and they're capable people who can make a difference with a president who wants to be activist. So get ready for it. But as a friend of mine, Paul Warwick, said some years ago, when the pigs start to scream, turn up the grease, because the pigs are squealing like crazy on this one. Well, Donald Trump's team is already looking into moving the U.S. Embassy in Israel. This has been a move that all of us have thought should have taken place years ago. Congress voted for it, but the State Department has blocked it. Now Trump says, I'm looking for a new location in Jerusalem to build the embassy. John Jessup has that.
That's right, Pat. Even before he takes office, Trump's transition team reportedly is looking for places to relocate the embassy, which would fulfill one of his campaign promises. Chris Mitchell brings us that story.
During his campaign, Trump pledged to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. His campaign manager, Kellyanne Conway, reiterated that pledge and said it's a very big priority for Trump. Some believe one possible location for the U.S. Embassy would be at the current site of the U.S. Citizen Services Office. It's located here in a Jerusalem neighborhood and considered a logical choice for a future embassy, but it's not the only potential site. According to Israel's Channel 2, another choice, the area of the nearby Diplomat Hotel, currently a home for elderly immigrants. The U.S. owns the property, but not the hotel. A third site is this abandoned lot in the busy Talpiot neighborhood, owned by the U.S. Former Israeli Finance Minister Yair Lapid says Trump's pledge to move the U.S. Embassy is an excellent idea.
It's about time. We are sitting now in Israel's capital.
According to opinion polls, Lapid is seen as a top contender for Israeli prime minister in the future. In response to a question from CBN News, Lapid told foreign journalists that every embassy should be in Jerusalem.
This is our capital. We waited 2,000 years to come back here, and we expect the world to acknowledge this fact and to recognize Jerusalem as our capital, and therefore we should have here the embassy.
He related a story from President Obama's recent trip to Israel.
I remember not long ago on Shimon Peres's funeral, the White House issued a statement saying the president was in Jerusalem, and then they changed it not to mention Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And this was in Western Jerusalem. It wasn't even in Eastern Jerusalem. And I think this is preposterous.
No country in the world recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital. A State Department official told CBN News, since Israel's founding, administrations of both parties have maintained a consistent policy of recognizing no state as having sovereignty over Jerusalem. We remain committed to this long-standing policy. But in 1995, the U.S. Congress passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act, mandating the move of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So far, every president has avoided the move, citing security concerns and signing a special waiver. moving the embassy wouldn't make everyone happy.
There will be happiness on the Israeli side, there will be unhappiness on the Arab-Palestinian side. There may be riots, there may be violence.
Some say the move must come in the wider context of an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. Others believe Jerusalem is Israel's eternal, undivided capital. In the meantime, many say if the move is ever going to happen, Trump is the one to get the job done. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Pat, a bold move.
Well, I have talked to people who maintain this incredible fiction that the capital of Israel is Tel Aviv. Well, that's just nonsense. It's not Tel Aviv, it's Jerusalem. It has been Jerusalem forever. And this is their eternal headquarters. I met some time ago with Yasser Arafat, and he wanted Jerusalem. The Palestinians want Jerusalem. You see, if they got Jerusalem, then they'll have a key position in taking over all of Israel. I mean, it's the chess game, and this is, they move the knight, and then they move the castle, and so forth. But it's time the United States face up to reality. The Parliament of Israel is in Jerusalem. The headquarters of their main offices are in Jerusalem. The Prime Minister is in Jerusalem. The Knesset is in Jerusalem. That's their capital. Can you imagine some nation dealing with the United States said, well, look, we're not going to acknowledge Washington as your capital. We're going to go to Baltimore. Well, you know, that's nice, but Baltimore is not our capital. Washington is. And so Trump's going to do it. It's nice to have somebody that's going to tell those namby-pambies at the State Department, look, you do it my way or else. I just like a bold, we want bold leadership. We haven't had that. And the United States is crying out for bold, as Ronald Reagan said, I'm going to paint in bold colors, not pale pastels. John.
Pat, here at home, pastors in Massachusetts are celebrating a big win for religious freedom. It comes after the state revised its interpretation of an anti-discrimination law that involved how churches dealt with important biblical issues, including sexuality. As Heather Sells reports, it would have forced many churches to break the law in order to follow their beliefs.
As the country's strictest anti-discrimination law, it threatened to control how churches communicate about gender and sexuality and how they operate their bathrooms. The strategy, the Massachusetts State Attorney General and Anti-Discrimination Agency deciding that a church would be considered a place of public accommodation if it hosted a secular event, such as a food pantry. Under a public accommodation designation, the church would be forced to follow the law and its rules about gender identity. Pastor George Small and 3 other pastors sued the state, saying that it violated their First Amendment rights.
It could affect me as a pastor and what I teach and how we operate as a church. I mean, this is new ground.
Pastor Small was joined in the suit by pastors Marlene Yo, Esteban Carrasco, and David O'Coin. They also spoke with CBN.
This law is really tying our hands, not allowing us to be who we are. And the government has no place.
There's all this talk of a wall of separation of church and state. Where is it when it comes to something like this?
The victory for the churches comes with a new interpretation of the law. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office now says that it was not right to automatically consider houses of worship as places of public accommodation.
They recognize that they have no legal authority to apply this law carte blanche to churches.
The pastor's attorney says they are overjoyed by the state's decision and are dropping their lawsuit.
It's a great day in the state of Massachusetts when both the Commission and the Attorney General recognize the freedom of every church to operate consistently with its faith.
The Attorney General's office even credited the pastors for taking on the state, noting, quote, "Your lawsuit caused us to focus on these issues and to make this revision." Now there's a growing precedent that churches should not be considered places of public accommodation when it comes to LGBT laws. In Iowa this fall, a federal court shut down a similar attempt to classify churches.
It's an excellent sign that the Massachusetts Commission and Attorney General have likewise backpedaled and said, look, we admit that the First Amendment protects the freedom of churches to operate consistently with their faith.
Holcomb notes that the Massachusetts win would not have happened without these 4 pastors and their willingness to take a stand. Both the Massachusetts and Iowa victories should serve at the least as a warning to any other state trying to use LGBT laws to control churches. Heather Sells, CBN News.
Thanks, Heather. Pat, a big win for religious freedom.
I remember when I met with the Cardinal of New York some years ago, and we were talking about Georgetown and the whole idea that they had to use their money, the Catholic Church's money, to have private meeting places for homosexual students and other accommodations. And I said, well, if you were forced to do it, what would you do? He said, I'd close the school down. I mean, just like that. They weren't going to do it. And that was a brave cardinal. Unfortunately, most churches have backed down on these things, but these brave pastors in Boston won a victory. You say, well, that's pretty, small victory that says the church can identify people on account of their sex they were born with and have bathrooms and accommodation. That's all they're doing. And, well, that's something. And
there's something to be said also that we all should learn from in standing up and challenging.
The devil is a bluffer. He always bluffs. And you'll find it in Putin, you'll find it in the Ayatollahs, you'll find it all the way up and down the line. There's always a bluff. And if you stand up to the bluff, you usually will win. And those people stood up to, the big beast saying, oh, we're going to get you. And they said, no, you're not. We're taking our rights. Well, good for them. Okay.
Good for them.